Israel in crisis, a wave of killings in Israeli military raids, attacks on Palestinians by Jewish settlers, and continuing protests against proposed changes to the judicial system. How responsible is the country's new far-right government for the violence and the unrest? And how is it all likely to end? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Israel is in the grip of a political crisis driven by the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right coalition government. A wave of Israeli military raids has led to scores of Palestinians being killed and injured. Jewish settlers have attacked Palestinian communities under the watch of the Israeli army. And widespread protests over planned judicial reforms have swept the country and are intensifying. We'll be discussing all this in just a few moments with our guests. But first, Imran Khan reports from occupied East Jerusalem on what's behind the current crisis.
The protests are holding firm for months now. Protesters have been out on the streets every Saturday in large number in places like Tel Aviv, Haifa, West Jerusalem, and they're getting their voice heard and they're putting pressure on the Prime Minister and this government. They say that the judicial reform bill is anti-democratic. The ability of the Knesset to overturn Supreme Court decisions is a big driving factor in that anti-democratic accusation that the protesters keep saying is happening. The government's referring to them as anarchists. They say that these people are being funded by a foreign hand. What do they mean by that? Well, effectively, they mean the CIA, which is extraordinary to hear given Israel's relationship with the United States of America. But that relationship is under threat as well. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, absolutely desperate to go to two key places, the United Arab Emirates and the United States. Both of those countries aren't extending the invites that perhaps the Prime Minister would like. And the reason for that is the makeup of his government. In order to get power, he had to give concessions to the far right. People like the Finance Minister, Smotrich, who actually the other day said the Palestinian village in the occupied West Bank of Haaretz should be wiped out by the Israeli state. Now you also have Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the National Security Minister. On Wednesday, he ordered police to crack down on protesters in Tel Aviv. That's never been seen before. Stun grenades were used. There was water cannons being used, heavy-handed riot police tactics, kind of thing we see against Palestinians here in occupied East Jerusalem on a regular basis, but never in Tel Aviv. But there is a large amount, a silent majority of people in Israel that support Benjamin Netanyahu and this government. They say they need to have a heavy hand when it comes to the Palestinians, when it comes to dealing with the Israeli protesters as well. However, that's angering a lot of the protesters who are now saying that we are headed towards being a dictatorship, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu eventually wants to become that dictator. Also, a lot of analysts here are suggesting that the only reason for this just judicial reform bill being discussed in the Knesset is because the Prime Minister and other ministers have court cases against them. Now, all of that is coming to a head. What that head looks like, we have no idea. But something is brewing, and the protesters know it, the Palestinians know it, and this Israeli government knows it as well. Imran Khan for Inside Story, occupied East Jerusalem.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by our guests. In Tel Aviv is Gideon Levy, he's a columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. In Haifa is Sally Abed, a member of the national leadership at Standing Together, which is the largest Arab Jewish grassroots movement in Israel. And in Brussels, we have Stephen Erlanger, who's chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Welcome to all of you. Gideon, I'd like to start with you before we get into what all this means. Just trying to get an idea of the level of support or otherwise for these so-called reforms. We've seen widespread protests for weeks now. What proportion of society do they represent, do you think?
It's very hard to judge, but it's very clear that the elite of Israel, the intellectual, the financial, the juristic, and the military elite of Israel is against this reform. while the lower classes, and it is also about a class conflict, a conflict between classes, the lower classes are still supporting Netanyahu, and by the end of the day, it is half and half, roughly speaking.
And Steve Erlanger, would you agree with that? Would that be your assessment as well?
That's what it certainly looks like. Bibi has always fancied himself the representative of the sort of left behind, of the North African Jews. This is what Likud began, what Menachem Begin began, and Bibi inherited. What strikes me is the anger from the elite Gideon talks about. It's like they've been woken up from a sleep.
Right, and now, Sally, you're one of the many protesting against these changes. You're from Standing Together. Just to give us some context, just tell us a little bit about your group, what it represents, and what you stand for.
Absolutely. Standing Together is, you mentioned that we are a grassroots movement. We work throughout the country, locally as well as nationally, around issues of peace, equality, and social justice. And what Standing Together is really trying to do through these protests, which are obviously, not led by one movement, but rather is led by, tens of different organizations and organized group, as well as very organic mobilization of Israelis who are going onto the streets. And what we are trying to do is really understand also strategically as well as politically what's the best way we can capitalize on this moment.
You represent all sides of the spectrum, and you've been protesting today, throughout the last few weeks. What sense have you got the mood?
The mood is very, very accurate to what Gideon and Stephen really described. It is the elite, and while that's good because usually the elite does have a certain power and is usually can voice out its frustrations and its demands in much more effective way, it's not enough. What we're trying to do is expand that to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who obviously oppose the reforms and the current government, but are not taking any active part in these protests, as well as to the social and geographic peripheries of Israel, which, as was mentioned as well, are the support base of the current government.
And what's your sense of the first question I posed, how much opposition is there for these measures and how much support?
The question is not about support. If you really look at the junctions of real change and real, revolutions, you need active opposition. And at the moment, as I said before, unfortunately, the current protest is overlooking the base of the current government, which is geographic, economic, and social geographies of Israel. Peripheries, of Israel, but they are also overlooking the Arab Palestinians in Israel, which I think are the key. So I would say that they are a large minority, but they are still a minority.
Right. Steve Erlanger, in your role in Jerusalem previously as bureau chief for the New York Times, you got to know Netanyahu very well. What do you think his motivations are for these changes from his point of view?
Well, I can't read into his brain, first of all, and it's very complicated. I think he's confused himself, but there's a political element, which is he wants to stay in power. His base is changing. It's becoming more religious, more right-wing. And he has he's gone to bed with some people he wouldn't have touched in the past. And he's done that to be in power. And he likes being in power. And in some ways, he's pretty good at it. But there's another element, which is simply personal, which is he wants to stay out of jail. As long as he's in power, he has immunity from prosecution for long-standing charges that Gideon knows a lot more about than I do, but basically have to do with corruption and taking benefits in office. So as long as he's prime minister, he stays out of jail. And as long as he's in bed with some of these very ultra-religious, close to ultra-right-wing coalition partners, he gets to stay in power. But
Right.
it's a complicated issue, and I think in his own head, I hope there's some degree of ambivalence.
So knowing him as you have done, does his positioning surprise you, Steve, in any way from the man you first met?
Well, it's like asking me about Putin. I used to know him too, and people change, and people get a bit desperate. I think Bibi has a bit of a kind of, he's a narcissist, and he thinks he's the best to lead Israel, and I think he worries about Iran, and he worries about lots of things, and he believes he can control his coalition partners, but we have to see whether that's actually true. Does he really want to upturn the entire Israeli constitutional system? I suspected of heart of hearts he doesn't, but I'm not sure he knows quite how to manage what he's now in bed with.
Gideon, what's your sense?
I couldn't agree more with Steve. I think that in many ways, Benjamin Netanyahu is a story of a tragedy. A highly gifted politician, an intellectual, someone who is the most beloved and the most hated figure in Israeli politics for the last 15 years or so, is pushed himself into an impossible corner in which, as Steve rightly mentioned, he finds himself surrounded by people that he wouldn't like to be surrounded with, and in positions that I'm not sure are his positions. But the train left the station. He is there. He is stuck there. Right now, his presence his political presence creates a terrible turmoil for Israel, which, by the way, might end up in a good way. Because for people like me, the last decades in Israel were decades of an ongoing masquerade in which nobody really dealt with anything except of the next vacation and the next new Jeep. And here, all of a sudden, the Israeli society woke up. It woke up on the wrong reasons. It still keeps a blind eye over the occupation, which is 10 times more crucial for the future of Israel than one legal reform or another one. But still, there is a wake-up call. Benjamin Netanyahu created it by his behavior, and now it's all about, will it end up only about the legal reform, or will it really bring Israelis to start to think about themselves, to look upon themselves, and to see who are we? Don't they see that we are living in an apartheid state? Until now, they didn't see it. Maybe this will lead them to realize in what state they are living and in what regime they are living.
All right, we'll explore that a little bit more in just a second. But Sally, Abed, I just wanted to ask you, where do you think this is all heading? It's hard to believe this government's only been in place, for just over a couple of months. And the tone has been very quickly set, hasn't it, with all this violence and the raids and so forth, and indeed this pushing through of the changes to the judiciary. What's your sense about where this is going? And what about the protests? How do you think they're going to gather pace or not?
I definitely, this is a very essential, this is a junction, a historic junction for the Israeli public who is for the first time, I think, really questioning the idea of democracy. Democracy for the first time is really on the main table being discussed. I agree with Gideon that I think, the main discussion was triggered by the wrong reasons. And I do think that it's the question, really, the question is whether the new left that is emerging in Israel which didn't exist, for many years, and now is a little bit stronger than it was before. A left that is Jewish Arab in essence, a left that is more progressive, that is also will be successful to talk to not only the elite, the old elite, which is now on the streets, as well as Palestinians in Israel with conditional partnership that we had. Now we are creating a new kind of partnership and a new kind of majority in Israeli society that can talk to Palestinians and to the peripheries, as I mentioned before. If we are able to capitalize on that and redefine democracy, not only restore it for the Jews, and by the way, not just for the Jewish people, but also for very certain groups of the Jewish Israelis. Because if you ask the Mizrahim right now, and if you ask the Ethiopians, if you ask former USSR immigrants, they also tell you that they don't feel like they were fully partners of the Israeli democracy. So I think this is the question right now. Do we want to redefine democracy? And I can't tell you what's going to happen. I do think that we're not as big as we want to be coming to this moment, to this very critical moment. But I do think that there are many opportunities that we'll be able to take with us for the next years, and hopefully we'll be able to compete with the current
very interesting
culture.
It's the question, could this be a tipping point, Steve? I mean, well, there's one thing, as Sally says, for the Israeli public to question what's happening. What about the international community? And I'm sure that Gideon won't mind me quoting what he wrote, that what the far right has done is to remove the mask that enables Western complacency. So the question, Steve, is will this precipitate anything meaningful as far as the international community is concerned, or will the status quo just meander on?
I have to say, in my experience, in America and in Europe, there has been a kind of reluctance to recognize that Israel has changed considerably in the last 15 years. There's still an image of an old Israel, which is a little more liberal and so on. Israel, as everyone here knows on this show, is becoming more right-wing, more religious, tougher in its views about its own Arab citizens, let alone the Palestinians, which supports more and more settlements, grabbing land. This is not, your grandfather's Israel. And I think young Americans, and I would say, Americans under, let's say, 35, do have trouble with this Israel. I mean, sometimes in simple terms, they just see Israel as creating Palestinian victims. People aren't very sophisticated about the complications of a small, complicated, intimate country, which Israel is. And people aren't very sophisticated about the problems of the Palestinian Authority and what it's actually like on the West Bank and in Gaza. I admire Gideon Levy for writing about these things for so long and for so well. But I think right now the world is looking at Ukraine. That's what I've been doing for the last year. And its attention is on Israel right now is quite intermittent. But in the long run, I think this kind of thing very much hurts Israel's image in the rest of the world and its leverage. At the same time, we see Israel moving toward better relations with the Gulf, with Arab countries. So that's going on too, and we shouldn't forget that. That's also the work of people like Bibi Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm. Gideon, what do you think? Could it force the international hand to act further, or is it still going to be looking elsewhere, as Steve says?
I wish I could disagree with Steve and tell you that the world will change now and the world will start treating Israel as it should treat Israel, but it's a long way to go. It's a very long way to go, both in the United States and in the EU. But there are first signs, and what 55 years of brutal occupation didn't do, few months of protest against some legislations did do. Because you see that Europe, even the Germans, God forbid, dare to criticize Israel more than in the past. The United States is giving a cold shoulder to Netanyahu. This is nothing, obviously, because as long as the world will not move from talkings, from condemnations, hollow condemnations, to deeds, like it knew very well to do with Russia, like they knew very well, obviously, to do with South Africa, as long as it will not move from talkings to deeds, to actions, nothing will change. But I think there is an opening now, because as again, sorry to mention Steve all the time, but as Steve said, there is a new generation, and Steve didn't mention also the Jewish new generation in the United States, which start to ask some questions. I mean, young Americans are asking, where is our tax money going to? Is Israel really the place that deserves so much money? A state which ignores our policy, ignores our requests, and ignores the international law. So it's a long way to go, but it's a nice beginning.
Sally, do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu underestimated the strength of opposition there would be to this?
I don't think so. I think he was aware and anticipating this kind of opposition. I just think that he didn't have a choice. He didn't have a choice. He is very, I don't know, however, if he was aware of how much, when you're desperate, I don't think he was very calculating without underestimating his genius, honestly. I do think that he maybe underestimated the kind of predicament he's going to find himself in within Israel, but also, with the international community.
And do you think the ongoing attacks on Palestinians will intensify and more land grabs will be made and, settlements, going into settlements and doing what they do?
I think so, unfortunately. This is the one thing, escalations in the occupied territories and with Palestinians, especially Palestinians in the occupied territories, is something that has been a very useful tool for Bibi Netanyahu historically, and we see that now as well. They are really trying to provoke and allowing provocations, let's say. I'm going to be very soft and say allowing and not say even leading those provocations. Not maybe, but, the ministers in his government. And it works. Why it works? Because it polarizes exactly in the opposite direction that benefits them. It polarizes Jewish people against Palestinians, and it definitely creates a false sense of unity within the Jewish public, which is exactly what would serve him right now. I don't think it's working, though, even though, I was very critical of the protests and the fact that they did not criticize or they did not oppose not just the judicial reform, but the settler reform and the deepening of the occupation and the apartheid. And we see really steep, very determined steps towards apartheid, not just in the occupied territories, but also here for me as a Palestinian in Israel. And I do think that he is really aware of that, and it's a very dangerous situation that we.
Steve, I just want to bring you in finally. Of course, money in the pocket always has an effect on the street, doesn't it? This has had a big impact on the economy. Credit ratings agencies looking very closely at downgrading Israel. How do you see that panning out? What kind of effect could that have?
Well, that creates pressure too, because Bibi's been one of the best finance ministers Israel ever had. But I would just go back in the last moment I have to what Sally said. I think she's making a very good point, which is violence can be used in all kinds of ways. It can be provoked. It can create false unity, false fears, real fears. This is why I say, you know, Bibi's riding a tiger, but he's got to be careful because the tiger's hungry.
And Gideon, how do you think this is going to end?
If I would tell you that I know, I would just cheat you. Nobody knows how it can end. You cannot see any scenario which ends it because both sides are now very strong in their demands. There might be something from the outside which will make a change. For example, an uprising of the Palestinians, some kind of violence can put an end to this, or at least a temporary end. But no doubt that Israel, after this turmoil, will not be the same Israel. The only question is it going to be a better Israel or a worse Israel? And this is, unfortunately, a very open question yet.
Sally, finally, let's end on you then. What is your sense about how this is going to go over the next weeks and months?
I don't know about 2 weeks and months. I do know that, you know, as an organizer and as a Palestinian, as an activist here in Israel, I know that this is the time. You know, we are at very, very dangerous times. They're not irreversible. I do think that I'm not underestimating the things that can be irreversible, that will limit our space to act. It will limit me as Palestinian, you know, with the things that I can say and the things that I can do within Israel. With that being said, I also think that we need to look for not just the next week and the next protest and the next reaction to this government, but we need to start thinking of how to proactively attack this government and strategically build a new kind of opposition in Israeli society. And with that, really redefine the left and redefine Israeli democracy in many ways and Israeli society. And that doesn't take weeks or months. It takes years. And I think this will be the point where I hope more people will join us into building this new space.
All right.
I hope so.
It's been a big, important conversation, perhaps at a critical moment. Do appreciate your time. Thanks to all our guests, Gideon Levy, Sally Abed, and Stephen Erlanger. Thanks a lot. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.